Right, hello everyone. Welcome and thanks very much for joining this AFN Network Plus webinar on using systems thinking to transform our food, beans as an analytical lens. So I'm Jez Fredenberg, I'm your chair today. I'm based at the School of Environmental Sciences at University of East Anglia, where I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus. Also with me today helping out is my colleague, Professor Neil Ward. So if this is your first webinar or interaction with us, AFN is a UKRI funded project focused on identifying research gaps that could help reduce emissions in the UK agri-food system. We currently have around 1,800 members across the UK, and we run events, give out funding and connect people. So please join us if you haven't already. I will put links in the chat shortly. So as for today's topic, if you joined our webinar last month with Professor Gerald Midgley, you'll know a little bit about how systems thinking can be used to address highly complex problems. And of course, how we transform the food system while reducing emissions, ensuring everyone has access to healthy food, considering nature, etc. That is a highly complex problem. So in today's webinar, we're going to be taking what Gerald covered one step further and looking at how to put systems thinking into practice to address this problem. So we're going to be using the example of how to integrate more pulses into food and farming. And we're hoping that this should help kind of show why thinking about the wider system is so important when trying to create large-scale change in diets and food production. So our speaker is Professor John Ingram, who leads food systems research at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Gerald Midgley was going to be presenting, but I'm afraid he's been taken ill, so he won't be able to attend. But John has been working closely with him, and so we'll cover most of what he was going to talk about. So John has also been a NERC food security leader and originally trained in soil science. He also currently co-leads the Foresight for Food initiative, which explores how to improve our understanding of the risks and opportunities for the global food system. So he's going to be presenting thinking based on his research when he was an AFN Network Plus champion last year, and his work on something called the BeanMeals project, which he's going to be telling us about. So I will share his report that that's just been published in the chat shortly. John, if you're able to start getting your slides ready. If anybody has questions as we go along, please write them in the Q&A panel. We'll have about 30 minutes at the end for questions. Feel free to use the chat for discussion, sharing relevant links, that sort of thing. We are obviously recording this session. We'll be putting it on YouTube for others to see later. So if you don't want to be identified for any reason at all, maybe if you're going to ask a question, ask it anonymously. So John, over to you. If you can get your slides ready and share those, that'd be great.
How's that look?
That's looking great, thank you.
Excellent, good. Well, hello everybody, and good morning. As Jez said, I'm speaking really on behalf of myself and my close colleague Gerald. I'm sorry he's unable to be with us today, but perhaps, as Jez was saying, some of you would have joined him last month. So forgive me if I don't do justice to his contribution, but I'm going to do my best. So what we're going to be talking about now is the project BeanMeals. It's one of the projects funded from the Transforming UK Food Systems Strategic Priorities Fund. It's nearing the close now. We'll be winding up by the end of this year. And it's really been a remarkable journey that I hope I'm able to share with you. Really, it's all about systemic innovation. And again, this is Gerald's lead on the area. But he and I, for some years, have been thinking about how do we develop a practical approach to what is a theoretical area of work that he described. And when we jointly, together with colleagues with other universities, as you'll see in the logos, and colleagues in various partner organizations, put in the bid to this Transforming UK Food System programme, we thought that this would be the ideal opportunity, but capitalising on these two new varieties that have been developed by Warwick University. Now, those of you who may not know, the beans that we get in our tins, baked beans, classic baked bean tins, well, the majority of those come from North America, some from a few other countries. And that's because the varieties of beans needed in the baked bean tins are not able to grow in the UK conditions until now. And over the last 10 years or so, with BBSRC funding and various other inputs, colleagues at Warwick, Professor Holub and Roseanne Maguire, have been developing these beans. And as you see in the photo, the very first harvest was last September. And this harvest produced enough for us to actually work with these beans to see whether they would be acceptable to our palate and whether they would be acceptable to our catering systems and the various people who would use beans. So the key point about these is that they were developed for UK growing conditions, but not the whole of the UK, as we'll see shortly, only basically the south. Another really good feature is that they're quick cooking. And those of you who buy dried beans or pulses, remember you have to soak them overnight often and then boil them up for some time. But these varieties have been developed for quick cook, which is interesting both for convenience and for saving energy, of course. Gluten-free, low glycemic index, so very good for various formulations where people need that specific diet. And of course, being a legume, nitrogen fixing, which limits the amount of nitrogen and fertilizer that's needed, although it does need some to get the plants established. So that's really what this is about. And the project, well, it's called BeanMeals because we weren't just interested in beans, but beans as part of a meal, as we will see. But really, this project is about systemic innovation. And we're using these new bean varieties to explore what's necessary to actually change and transform the system. So the very simple hypothesis really is that food system transformation needs a systemic innovation approach. We cannot transform the food system piecemeal. It has to be seen as a system. As we know, it's a complex adaptive system, a sociological system, and we need to have systems thinking to be able to navigate the complexity. So the aims of the project really is to develop and analyze the use of systemic innovation to transform the food system outcomes towards better health, better environmental output, and of course, thinking about the viability of businesses all along the supply chain. So that's what the projects have been about. So just a quick recap. So what is systemic innovation? Well, really, it only generates value, as the quotation says, if it's accompanied by complementary innovations. That means to say you can't go it alone if you're somewhere in the system, and you need to be aware of the other actors, as they're called in the jargon, the other people in simple language who are involved not only in the supply chain, but in all the enabling services and policy formulation, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the opposite, really, to autonomous innovation, which can actually just fire off on its own and indeed do something very useful, but wouldn't necessarily change the system, transform it in the way that we're trying to do. So that's what systemic innovation is all about. So then it begs the question, so what's a system? Well, here's a very simple diagram, and the key words in the diagram are related to, first of all, the boundary, so what's in and what's out. What's out is the environment within which it operates, the political, the economic, the social, the physical environment. The elements within the system, cognizant that there are many bits and pieces that all work together to deliver the system outputs, often emergent behavior, and these feedback to affect the environment and, of course, therefore, act as inputs to the system. So that's essentially what's going on. But of course, here we are as an observer of the system. And as soon as you're observing the system, one is actually part of it. And it's not fair to say one can really stand completely outside if one's working with the actors within the system and analyzing their activities and having their activities change as a consequence of the observer's work. So that's what's going on with the system. Now, the other thing to say up front is the importance of system thinking skills. And from the last diagram, we will have seen the importance of the boundary, what's in, what's out, the relationships within the elements, appreciating the different perspectives of different people who are involved in working within and affecting the way the system operates, and understanding the emergent systems, the emergent properties. And this, of course, emphasizes different system approaches. So we need to have an approach for exploring and valuing the boundary. Different people will have different opinion of what should be included in the project. We need work on mapping the relationship, which is thinking about the feedbacks, the vicious and virtuous circles, and the possible consequences of intervention. We need to understand the system and the emergent properties, recognizing that these are feedbacks throughout the system, highly responsive at multiple levels, and of course, multiple time steps. And finally, appreciating the different perspectives and developing a mutual understanding of how people are viewing the system, what they want out of it, what their expectations are, and how willing they are to work together and implement the systemic approach. So the BeanMeals project takes what we call a food system approach. There are many diagrams in the literature, and I'm sure you're familiar with a whole raft of them. This is one that's been developed in our work in Foresight for Food. And as you see, it's got the central core activities, the food system activities, what we call the doing words. They're all ending in ing. But then there are supporting services in the institutional environment. All of this within the human and natural system leads to a set of food system outcomes that we're interested in. But of course, they feed back to affect the drivers themselves, and we'll see that later on. So that's the sort of whole system approach that we're adopting in the BeanMeals project. Now, one of the things that we did up front was to be slightly disruptive to the common mantra, fork to farm. That's all very well, but it does put the emphasis on the agriculture, if you see what I mean. And it's very hard often to move beyond that to think about post-farm gate. So if you conceptually start with what we eat, and you work backwards through the supply chain, through the different activities to actually, therefore, what we grow, one has a very different understanding and perspective on the various stages. And fundamentally, we as society are interested in what we eat. Obviously, some people are working in agriculture, are very interested in their livelihoods associated with it. But the bulk of us, and by far the majority of the UK population, are not farmers, and they are, however, all consumers. So we're thinking fork to farm. The research areas, four major components. First of all, how do we promote a healthier diet? How do we make meals attractive? How do we encourage people to adopt a new food source, which perhaps they're not familiar with? And how do we endeavor to make that tasty and flavorful by even though having low fat, sugar, and salt, which of course are some of the major things that we often enjoy. So we've got to be careful of that. Second thing is then how do we produce and supply bean-based foods and ingredients which would satisfy the culinary need? So that's everything from the primary production through to maybe the secondary processing, and to make an ingredient like a low glycemic index bean flour. Then we need to think, okay, so if these beans are actually grown at scale in the UK, and we'll look at that in a moment, what would be the overall benefits to the UK population health? What would be the winners and losers from an environmental point of view? And of course, it's got to work from a business point of view, because we are dependent on the actors who undertake the food system activities to actually deliver the food to our plates, and that requires a business proposition. And then fourth, but by no means least, which is really what it's all about, is understand how you actually design and implement a fork-to-farm systemic innovation approach. And that's why I say the project is really about systemic innovation. And it's using these wonderful new bean varieties as an analytical lens to explore the situation. So, promoting beans. We decided to work with a number of schools, and we decided to work in Leicestershire, partly because we had a prior experience of working with colleagues there in the county and the city councils, but also we had a very good relationship with some of the school operators there through our partner Food for Life. And we selected 6 schools, 3 in the city and 3 in the countryside. Over there, as in many counties, they have formal school catering arrangements with Leicestershire Trade Services and City Catering, who are responsible for providing the school meals. And we had the new beans, on the school menus for 4 months. We also worked with 10 families of some of the children who were in the school, and we were looking at the acceptability of these new beans, the new methods of cooking, the new sorts of ingredients that might make it a tasty meal as opposed to just a plate of boiled beans. And we were looking at how do we create demand in the school food procurement system. And this was actually fundamental because the schools operate with a procurement system. It's not just the school going out shopping, so to speak. And so one has to work through that procurement system with all its budgetary and food safety regulations inherent. We took a whole school food approach. Now that meant talking to the school as an ecosystem. Obviously, it needed the clearance of the senior staff and the head, and largely the governors who were involved. But it absolutely needed the buy-in from the catering staff. And those of you who were at school when I was at school will remember the power of the dinner lady. And so we had to be very inclusive in the approach, and all of the staff in the school were involved in designing and working with us and with the children, and to some extent with the parents of the children in question, to explore how we can develop this new menus. Now, the bean system in the UK is quite complicated. It's got a number of areas, as you see, going from left to right. The importing these beans that we normally have, in this case, of course, we'll be using UK grown beans, but wholesaling and procuring, going into catering, and right the way through on the right to cooking, to the food on the children's plates, and then beans in community kitchens that we'll talk about. So the local scene over on the right here is the retailing, the procuring, the Leicestershire Nutrition Services, etc., etc. And they were all involved at the local level, working from the national level, where they would normally be buying from a wholesaler. But of course, if the beans are coming in from abroad, or indeed these new varieties, they will need cleaning, they'll need processing and canning if we're going to have canned beans, and packaging if they're uncooked dry beans. And these, of course, in the bulk come from overseas, and so there is the global trade system as well. So that's really what's going on. And it's a story from local to global. Now, to help the school develop the curricula and to help the children understand where the beans have come from, literally and metaphorically, but also all the environmental issues involved along the line, all the business opportunities for local livelihoods and jobs. Even children at the 10, 11, 12-year-old were very cognizant of the need for jobs and livelihoods in the local environment, as well as increasingly aware of environmental concerns. And so there was a really good opportunity to work with the children to design a game which was called Beantopia. Very, very good game that was developed with the children. And it started off with a sort of fun exercise, scoping out what the children would like to include in a game. This is hand in hand with the lessons where the beans have been used as part of the curriculum. Joanne Craven, who's a professional games developer, helped us on this journey. There was then a design phase where the children were thinking, well, let's have something a bit like Snakes and Ladders, because we know how to play that. And here are the beans as counters. And then we get the actual game was finalized, polished up and printed and became a board set. And the children were able to play this. It's not just a game, it's really a mode of consolidation of the work they've been doing in their curriculum lessons to see how the system works as a system. So this was an opportunity to bring systems thinking in at a very early age in a fun and enjoyable way. And of course, the children were eating the beans at school lunch. So public procurement and the policy angle. The colleagues in Hertfordshire were leading this work. First of all, it was quite clear that the school meal policy and decision-making ecosystem needed to be understood. The public procurement as a driver for bean consumption, and that all levels and types of actors were interviewed with meetings through in 23, and it just confirmed the expectation that it's a complex and fragmented policy maze. The marketisation of the local authority school meals has been an issue. 1988 Government Act required competitive contract tendering, which is all very well, but that produced a balance between low cost versus quality. And the Schools Trust and the Multi-Academy Trust added further complexity to the procurement process. We had the years of budget austerity. We don't need to overplay that one, but we're all aware. And of course, the challenge of public procurement, school food standards, which are constantly being changed, incrementally altered. But there is an opportunity for good practice and innovation. And a change needs researchers all the way down the school meal supervision system. So what it really needs is a policy and practice change, that is to say systemic innovation, if we're trying to enhance the health and of the children in school, but of the wider UK community. Don't forget that this project in schools was but a case study using the beans as a case study. So it's a subset of the UK population as a whole, but it was a system that was easy to work with. So what we also realized is that there is an opportunity not only to work with schools, but with some social enterprises, with community kitchens, and colleagues in Warwick were very active in taking the new beans out with recipes showing how you can add tomatoes and chilies and onions and things like that and make a healthy, nutritious meal, which is really quite cheap. And this was done across a number of centres where there are community kitchens and through the Coventry Food Network and the like. So this was a different form of outreach to society. So where can these things be grown? So work led in Oxford was looking at the potential area for these new bean varieties. And broadly speaking, it's a line south of from the Wash to about Cardiff. And you can see on the map where suitable soil conditions exist for legumes, and this is based on field peas and field beans. The average area over the 8 years was about 158,000 hectares, dotted on all those little dots. Those are the fields where they're grown. And this is all available data from UKCEH. Now, the estimate harvest is 2 tonnes a hectare. So we need to remember that. You get 2 tonnes a hectare. And then if you want thousands of tonnes, you're going to have thousands of hectares. The current average consumption in the UK of beans and pulses is about 8.5 grams a day, dry. It's difficult data to actually get your head around because beans are pulses. There are other pulses which are not beans, but essentially it's, if we talk about beans and pulses as the way we want to enhance our nutrition. The Beans is How campaign has set out to double bean consumption globally by 2028. for environmental reasons as well as health. The Eat Well UK is saying that we should be having 34 grams of beans and pulses a day. And finally, the Eat Lancet recommendation is in the order of 50 grams of beans and pulses a day. Note, we're currently averaging 8. So it's going to have to be a massive uplift in consumption to actually achieve any of those goals. Just by way of a visual, you see the four scenarios, 8.5 current, going up to 50 on the Eat Lancet. So these have all been converted to dry bean weight, and it is complex getting the actual data, because some of the data is presented as wet, some of it's presented as dry, etc. And here we see a graph. The bars are the tons of beans which would be needed for a 67 million population if we were to cover 30% of the current area of our arable converted to UK beans. Now that's a massive thing to do. But the line, the self-sufficiency rate, shows that even with the baseline, we're only under 50% of self-sufficient, even if we covered 30% of the current area at 2 tons a hectare. And that is because we eat so many tins of baked beans and other pulses already. So even if we were to use these new varieties, as we say, over 30% of the current area, we would still only be satisfying about 50% of our current, and it goes right the way down to only 10% of the Eat Lancet recommendation. So it's not going to, be a massive change, but it can be a valuable contribution. So what would be the overall impact on food system outcomes? So we're interested in health, well-being. We're interested in environment. We're interested in biofiscal environment. We're interested in a fair and just system. And there's some work done by Hebnig and Zurich in this paper. You may have seen it. Slightly busy diagram, but what it's showing is in the center, the 4 major areas of things of interest, societal interest: clean and healthy planet, adequate, safe, healthy diet, etc., etc. And then the middle ring is some of the attributes of those various segments, and the outer ring is the approach and the method to achieve the middle ring. So this is going towards policy recommendations, where policy doesn't just mean monocentric government. It also means the policy of the private sector and civil society organizations as well. So when I use the word policy, remember, it's not just policy as in government. So this method exists. It's possible to develop radar charts around these, and you can have an outer ring, a further outer ring, which are actually metrics of success as we go forward. So that's the approach we're taking, and we've modified this diagram for work in Leicestershire. Well, I say we are modifying this diagram for work in Leicestershire. Some of you may be aware of a paper that's just come out, which was looking at the contribution of pulses to net zero in the UK, which was very much part of the agri-food net zero effort of last year. And I'd like to just congratulate Marcus and Loisanne for fantastic review, about 150 refs in that review. So do have a look at that if you're interested. So just to shift gears slightly, here we've got the Transforming UK Food System Strategic Priorities Fund. And the objective was to transform the UK food system. So just to sort of bring the presentation towards a close, what does that actually mean? When we say we need to transform the food system, well, no one would disagree, but no one actually says what you have to do, or who has to do what. And over the last few years, 5 or 7 years, this notion of food system transformation has really come center stage. And indeed, for the UN Food System Summit, it was the strapline. And what this the Academy Partnership said, it needed to require a radical transformation of the system. That's fine, but they didn't go into great detail. So it begs the question, what are we actually trying to transform? My answer to that is we're trying to transform the food system outcomes, the what we get from the food system, the health, the environment condition, the livelihoods, the fair and just work conditions, we're trying to transform those from state A to state B, which basically means poor diets to more balanced diets. So think of the food system outcomes, what we get from the system: poor environmental outcomes to better outcomes, poor animal welfare to better animal welfare. So these are the things we get from the system, and that's what we're trying to transform. So if we take that, in order to achieve this transformation, as it was noted earlier, it's going to require a major shift in mindset. Really excellent paper by Patrick Webb and colleagues you might have seen, which is really saying the possible futures need to be rethought versus the status quo. Status quo is what we get at the moment. It's fine for many. Some aspects are not fine for many. And what we're trying to do is improve the basic set and the balance across the food system outcomes. So this is going to mean shifting our expectations from what we're currently getting, which is arguably less good, to what we want to get, which is more good. And I can't really use any simpler language, because if one gets into tremendous detail, you can't see the wood for the trees. But if this is the direction of travel, then let's accept we want better food system outcomes, and we want them to be better balanced. So what do? First thing is to agree what outcomes are acceptable, which is the shift in mindset. Then we need to adapt our activities to transform the outcomes, because the outcomes won't just spontaneously change. They will only change because we're undertaking our activities in a different way. So the degree of transformation that we seek in the outcomes will really dictate the level and intensity of adaptation required in the activities. And it really is going to be a huge process of negotiation, because with any intervention, there will be winners and losers. And the losers may be an environmental parameter like river water quality, or it may be somebody's livelihood. The winners may be a new business opportunity or increased biodiversity, whatever it is. But it's going to need people skilled really in the ability to as I say, to navigate this food system complexity using systems thinking that we were working on earlier. So what are the overall impacts on food system outcomes if Beans goes to scale? That was the question. Here we have a very simple diagram again. We've got our food system activities at the top, which collectively lead to our food system outcomes, food security, obviously, but also our socioeconomic outcomes, employment, health, et cetera, and the environmental outcomes, land used, water availability, biodiversity, et cetera. And you can add your own bullets if you think I've missed some. The issue is balancing what we want from the system with what we do, as in the activities, and hence what we get. And this really is the nub of it. And how do we transform the food system outcomes in such a way that they improve the balance across the bottom of the diagram, so that we have better health and better environment, and we don't want to have one expended at the expense of the other. So there are trade-offs, and we're aware of those, but there are also synergies, and we need to capitalize on the synergies. So who has to do what? So here are the outcomes we wish to transform. We want to transform the food system outcomes, which means we need to adapt our food system activities. Food system activities, we, the people, the actors, don't just spontaneously do something differently, whether we farm differently or process food differently or consume differently, but we respond to a signal. And the signal can be an opportunity, a new business opportunity, or a threat, knowledge that if I overeat sugar, salt, and fat, it's bad for my health. So signals, we respond to signals. So how do we manage the signals? And the signals are a combination of the food system policies, again, across the public and private sector, interacting with the biophysical, social, economic context, the environment. This is what sets the signals. So as you go around the diagram, the signals mean that we, the actors, adapt our activities in order to transform the outcomes to a more desirable set. But in so doing, there is, of course, a feedback, because it's a complex adaptive system. And so the very act of changing adapting our activities to transform the outcomes will affect the context. So that means that the policies need to be continually reassessed as this dynamic system is better and better understood. So who has to do what? We, the actors undertaking our activities, all need to think about adapting our activities, and the policy formulation people need to continually reassess the situation, given the opportunities to see how a particular signal will deliver a transformed outcome. So some of the outcomes from the work. Policy movement and change for schools would be really excellent to improve the standards, to include dietary fibre, include all schools in the government buying standards. These are some strong recommendations have come forward, and weighting towards quality away from the best value. So it's a real challenge with the budgets that the schools and the school system has to play with, but that the public procurement should really be ring-fenced and inflation-linked, and there must be improved government funding, and to legislate a widening of free school meal entitlement, particularly if it's with more healthy meals. So school food culture, how to introduce the beans, if they're not these new UK beans, but other sorts of beans and pulses, would be really important, and that could become part of the Ofsted inspections. And this would actually result in a better policy ecosystem, which is trying to realise the BeanMeals case study. And this indeed was cited in the independent review of the food sector procurement just recently. So there was some impact, which is really good to see. However, there is currently a competing agricultural policy ecosystem for beans as food. And what we need to understand is the very sort of nature of the production base in the UK, together with all the post-cap opportunities that are presented for growing these sorts of beans. Some innovations to explore through our work with 3 Keel. One, first of all, could have a sector-wide programme. One could have a minimal processed bean product, which can be largely hidden in beans, in meals. One can have investment into beans as alternative to pea protein, which is currently the main protein used in plant-based alternatives. We could have financial schemes to de-risk bean crop rotations for farmers. It's always a challenge to have a new variety and work with the new harvesting system. We could have farmer clusters who could share costs and knowledge on the new varieties. And really, the big one is a social enterprise that works across the value chain to oversee and manage specific innovations and bring them together so that they are indeed a systemic innovation. So some initial conclusions. There is a tremendous potential for increased demand to be triggered if we can start with children's families, but we've got to be a bit clearer on where the current blockages are. There is the potential for increased production, albeit from a very low baseline, if the benefits to farmers can be made clear. So the market opportunity has to be very clear, and we have the supply infrastructure which needs investment, which is right along the value chain so that it comes to us as we want. And the obvious potential to look for where we deliver change that works across all 3 parts of the value chain, the primary production, the processing, and the consuming, is what is needed for the systemic innovation. So to closing bullet is that systemic innovation is needed to transform the system. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, John. That was really interesting. I've got loads of questions, and there are lots here as well. I just wanted to sort of kick off, you sort of at your last point, systemic innovation is needed to transform the system. I just wondered whether there is much systemic innovation happening at all in terms of beans across sort of food processing, manufacturing, retail, that kind of thing. Is there much interest? Do you know if there's much interest in increasing
Yes.
beans in that sense?
Well, there is. There are some SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, Hodmer-Dodds, you may have heard of.
Yeah.
Bigger. There's another one, I've just forgotten the name of it, which are full end-to-end enterprises, and they are taking that systemic approach. They're relatively niche, a little bit in the sort of high-end market, but nonetheless, they are further good examples of the potential, the commercial potential. Getting the big canning agencies, Kraft Heinz and Princes and the like, to engage will require an assurance that there is a sufficient supply. And here we have a chicken and egg, because the grower is not going to plant a large acreage if they're not confirmed as a market, and the market isn't there if the supply isn't available. So this is a sort of slowly, and use some examples.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier that the fact that it's a different way of thinking, isn't it? It's a mindset shift, and that's quite interesting, because I think whenever you talk to farmers, like for example at Groundswell next week, people often talk about it being a mindset shift, moving towards more regenerative or agroecological kind of farming. So, I mean, that sounds like a massive undertaking, doesn't it, to sort of create mindset shift across public policy, but also in terms of individuals and how we all consume beans. How would you kind of see that happening? Does that sort of feel like more of a grassroots thing, or what kind of does that look like?
Sure. Mega question.
Yeah.
I mean, let's go back to the £50 million transforming the UK food system. That was the project grant. I think the thing to look for is use that money to give really good examples of what needs to be done. £50 million isn't going to transform the UK food system, but it's going to give some remarkably good examples of what needs to be done. And our argument is it needs to be done from a systemic viewpoint.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a big one. It's a big one, but nonetheless, we've got to make a start.
Yeah. I'm going to move to questions here.
Please.
We've got quite a lot. So Rosie, somebody called Rosie says, has there been an analysis or forecast of how the new beans that you were developing would respond to climate change, and how might that change the geography of the best growing areas in the UK?
Sure. Well, work in progress. Of course, the climate envelope is changing. The growing conditions will change along with that. Have you got the right soil types? Have you got the right, pest and disease management? All of it. That is a whole nother area of research. This project is not a project about agriculture. It's a project about, as I've been explaining, but nonetheless, it recognises the fact that that very simple line I had from the Wash down to the Bristol Channel, obviously it's not a straight line. It's going to be flexible, but it depends on the market. I mean, those of you on the call who've been involved in farming will know that you farm to a market.
Absolutely. Just a comment on that from Azam Lashkari, who is based at the John Innes Centre. She's saying, I've got a comment about where to grow beans. I reckon we need a systemic agroecological zoning for the UK to see where it's suitable. And then she's also saying, regarding shift in mindset, how can we convince people to switch to seasonal local fruits? Oh, that's probably not. I'm not sure if that's right for this presentation. One from David Clough here at the University of Aberdeen. The estimates of the land area that could be devoted to bean production seem to be based on land currently used to grow peas and beans. Is there also potential for beans to be grown on land currently used for grazing animals or growing fodder crops?
Yeah, or indeed growing wheat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which feed animals a lot. Yeah.
Well, that's right. But what do we want to use our land for? The argument we've been putting forward in this project is that if a certain area was put down to beans, what would be the overall benefits from the system outcomes point of view? That was the question. Where that land is going to be found, if you put beans instead of field peas, you're going to have fewer peas. if you put beans instead of wheat, you're going to have less wheat. You know, that's not sort of anything but obvious. Where the beans can be grown does depend on soil and does depend on climate, and there is an opportunity to explore that further.
Just following up from that, really, Elsa Richmond-Seaton says, what type of labour is needed in this systemic innovation? And do we have enough of it? And I guess along with that, the sort of skills, I think that's a really important question.
Yeah, excellent. Well, wonderful question. It depends how the scaling is done. If you imagine 1,000 small-scale operations working on a relatively local level, you know, like at Hodmedod's, 1,000 of those, then there's a huge opportunity for new jobs and livelihoods at the local level. If, however, you have a few mega operations which are consolidating, it needs, of course, far fewer people. Agricultural machinery is basically the same stuff. You have a combine harvester, you just need to have a slightly different cutter head so that it can handle these beans, because the beans are quite low hung on the plant. So you still only need one combine driver. Mm-hmm. It just depends on how you want to do the scaling.
I guess this then goes, if we sort of take it on another level, so we look at the sort of processing around it, because there's a question here about the provision of, you know, being innovative with the beans themselves and sort of using more sort of like paste and bean flour and things like that. And do you think that has quite a large scope? Because I feel like we don't really see much of that around still, do we? And again, do we have those sorts of companies and processing facilities for that currently?
Yes. It's mainly pea flour used in vegetarian option meat substitutes. I don't know enough about the technology of the processing. That's the remit of the food chemists and the like. But the point about these Warwick beans is they have been tested for their allergenicity, for their protein content, and for their ability to be ground to make flour and this sort of thing. What you then do with the flour, you know, it's very complicated to make a Pringles type crisp. I mean, complicated chemistry and physics and stuff. So it's not a given that you can just turn these beans into something, you know, yummy and munchy. But there is the opportunity for further research in that, and our colleagues in Camden BRI have been very much part of the project, looking at options for alternatives to use the flour.
There's a question here from Toby Pepperell, which is sort of related to that. Did you look into the scope or interest for public subsidies, or this is UBI, I'm not quite sure what that is, associated with specific crops, those types of, sort of public-private partnerships?
No, I think not as far as I know. I mean, it's possible that our colleagues at Warwick, who have been leading the agronomic angle of this project, have that going, but I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Going back to schools, question here from Robert Barber. I'm guessing that's you, Robert, from Sustainable Food Trust, asking what were the main barriers you encountered in the schools you worked with? And I had a question around that as well. If I could add to that, John, I was sort of interested in how easy or not was it to get, I guess, buy-in from the children, parents, and sort of catering companies.
Well, it needed a lot of explanation and discussion. The 6 schools chosen were Food for Life schools, so they were already on the journey with us, so to speak, before the BeanMeals project arrived. I think the main barriers were the challenge of the budget constraint from the public procurement angle, and there was no barrier from the children. There was no barrier from the catering staff once they understood what this was about. And that's why I said the whole school ecosystem had to be involved and taken with us on this journey. And it was really heartening to see the success, basically because the children engaged.
And was that because they felt, they really cared about the sort of environmental side of it, or what do you think was the main thing that was of interest to them?
Um, well, something different, something fun, the opportunity for some of them to go to the field where they, saw the beans being harvested. Indeed, some children planted some beans earlier in the season and they harvested their own beans, all of that sort of engagement stuff. But also, as I've said repeatedly, it was aligned to the curriculum. So it wasn't just fun on the edge. It was a way of delivering the curriculum across a number of disciplines. And the Beantopia game was a way of pulling it all together and consolidating that learning as well as having some fun.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question here from, apologies if I pronounce your name wrong, Cheng Dong. Was there any difference between schools in cities and suburban areas and between schools that offered more sort of agricultural projects? I'm not sure if that's relevant or not. I don't know whether you looked at schools that were only in cities, and it sounds like they were already involved in some sort of food.
Sure. Well, one of the many aspects of the research in the schools was the amount of food that was left on the plates after lunch.
Right.
And so that was being monitored by a small army of people. I wasn't directly involved, but what I understand is in the city, which is more culturally diverse, there was a greater acceptance to novel cuisine than in the country.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. We've got a question here from Joe Price. How confident are you that the policy ecosystem will change or adapt to be able to deal with the transformation needed? You mentioned currently agricultural policies are not joined up with education policies. Farmers will innovate when there is clear policy steer and when incentivized. You're not very confident, John.
Well, I'm just saying, wait for a fortnight.
Yeah. Yes. I don't know whether you've got any more thoughts on that you can share at all. Or in
Well,
terms...
I mean, one kind of lives in hope. And the point about our project, and of course all the projects, and indeed your own work in the Agri-Food Net, is to provide evidence, to provide message, to provide signal to the policy process. And here we're talking about the government policy process. But again, I refer to the private sector policy process, because that really is very powerful as well. And it has a lot of influence as well, we know. And so working with the private sector and formulating the private sector policy is a way into government policy. But my goodness, if we had a magic wand, we wouldn't be, I don't know, we'd be in a better place.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess with that, I mean, you sort of mentioned earlier, the need for systems thinking with all of this, and that would be obviously sort of across government as well. Is that something that you see? Do you ever see systems thinking in the private sector, or is that something that you think would be of use? That kind of
definitely.
understanding.
Well, increasingly so.
Yeah.
Our research team, well, many of people working in the food system space work with the private sector. We don't work for the private sector. I want to make that absolutely clear. We work with them as collaborators, and that's absolutely important. And increasingly interested in systemic innovation. Some people say there's a lot of greenwash going on, but actually a lot of it's sincere and trying to do something better for a business reason, of course, but at the same time for environmental benefit or health outcomes or whatever it is.
Question here from Andrew Shirley. As part of systemic innovation, should we be looking to tweak government support for farmers? For example, some new SFI options that deliver healthier food, and given the government's focus on the development of private markets to help mitigate climate change and biodiversity loss, should we be considering making health credits available along the food chain, as well as biodiversity and climate credits? So I guess Andrew's he's sort of getting at the fact that we've got, emerging markets for biodiversity credits and carbon credits, and with a system that had health credits, would that help encourage change?
Well, that's a really interesting idea. Goodness knows how it would work. But yeah, I mean, a nice idea. Let's explore it. Certainly, I think the carbon market, is no longer quite the Wild West it was, but the biodiversity market, who knows how that's going to operate. Um, the thing about the thing about food is that it's so fundamental to society. Any attempt to kind of mess with our food gets a huge pushback.
Mm.
It really is what one of our attributes of society. I'm not saying carbon and biodiversity aren't important, but it's not quite the same.
Not as personal, is it?
It's not as personal. No, absolutely. That's well put. Anyway, explore that idea. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think we'll bring it to a close, but just very quickly, a lot of people are asking whether the game is available.
Oh, right. Well, BeanMeals was not established as a commercial enterprise. But the BeanMeals, we are exploring with some other counties whether they would like to subsidize the production of the set. But the point is, there's not as much value in just having the game. The point is, it's the consolidation of years of learning in the school. And you might as well just have a game of Ludo, but I'm being slightly flippant, but there is much more to the game than the game.
Yeah.
And so we've always been cognizant of the fact that just giving out the game, fun though that would be, is kind of missing the point.
Mm.
But come back to us, and maybe we'll set up a private enterprise on the side.
Yeah. Just one quick question based on that, actually, John, because I think it sort of seemed like you were, with your work with the in schools, you were very much sort of using systems thinking. All the children were using systems thinking, weren't they? And I feel like often when we talk about systems thinking, it sort of feels like this very complex thing that is sort of only for sort of high level decision makers or academics or something.
Yeah.
But is it something that can be used much more at a sort of grassroots level and shouldn't be kind of actually taken away from ordinary people?
Oh, great point. The important thing, whatever the ability, whatever the age, is to be clear about the central tenets. What is the boundary of the system? What do you mean by system? What are the components? How do they interact? What are the outcomes? The very simple diagram I had.
Yeah.
Anyone can engage in that diagram.
Mm.
And the children, when they were designing the Beantopia game, had all those things in play as they were doing it, even though they weren't using the technical language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Have you got any tips on where people could go if they wanted to start, understanding more systems thinking and how to use it in their own work?
Well, go back to Gerald's excellent seminar last month. I mean, there's a massive literature, innovation systems and all the rest of it. I mean, as I say, just start. If somebody really wants to start again, have a look at that seminar last month, and thank you for arranging it.
Yeah, no worries.
Gerald is one of the preeminent people in this world, in the systems thinking world. So no better place to start than that. Very sorry he's not able to be here today, and he sends his apologies to you all.
No worries at all. Well, thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it now, but I will put that a link to that webinar in the chat shortly, actually. John, thank you so much. That was really interesting and loads of engagement from people on questions and the chat. People have been sharing lots of links to research they've been doing and their own sort of insights. So we'll have a look at that afterwards.
Okay.
But thank you everybody for coming as well and all your input. We'll be putting this video on YouTube in a few days and emailing it out to everybody so you can watch it back.
And let me just acknowledge all the people who've been involved in the BeanMeals project across the universities, etc., and the schools.
Brilliant, thanks, John. So our next webinar will be on the 23rd of July. We're talking to the speaker today, so we'll be able to announce that shortly. and we'll share the link in an email as well and put it out on social media. In the meantime, if you want to browse our back catalogue on YouTube, if you missed any of the previous webinars, then you can do so, or get in touch with Neil or myself on another topic. But thank you, everybody. I'll share those in the chat in a second. But for now, thanks very much and see you next month.
Okay, bye.
Bye.